Before you enter this story, prepare yourself. What you are about to hear is not just about a wedding, but about a mother erased from the frame of her own son's life. Every word carries the weight of sacrifice, betrayal, and silence turned into strength. If this story touches you, don't let it vanish into the dark. Subscribe, share it so others can feel its truth, and leave your voice in the comments, because no mother should ever be asked to disappear. The flash went off and I blinked against the sudden brightness, but it wasn't the light that burned my eyes. It was the whisper that sliced into me just before the camera clicked. My daughter-in-law leaned close, her breath sweet with champagne, her voice soft enough that only I could hear. "You ruin every memory. Stand aside, as if you don't exist." Then she stepped back, her lips curled in a smile that fooled the crowd, and the photographer adjusted his lens as though nothing had happened. Around us, laughter rippled, not sharp, not cruel, but casual. The kind of laughter that wounds more because it pretends to be harmless. And I stood there, my hands clutching the bouquet I had bought with my own money, my chest tight, my feet heavy, realizing that in this celebration meant to bind family, I had been told I was not part of it at all. I had woken that morning at 5, long before the sun rose, to prepare for the wedding of my only son. The small boarding room where I lived was lit by a single flickering bulb, and I ironed my dress carefully, smoothing each crease as though pressing my love into the fabric. It was not new, it could never be new, but it was clean. A muted shade of green, my late husband had once said, made me look dignified. I put on the shoes I had bought 3 years earlier for a cousin's funeral, polished until they shone like they were trying to forget their age. I braided my hair slowly, pinning it into place with the care of someone who knew she would be photographed only once in a lifetime moment. My heart thudded with pride, not for myself, but for him. The boy I had raised through nights of hunger and years of toil, now stepping into a future I had prayed for even when I could not afford bread. I arrived early at the venue, a modest hall dressed in white cloth and borrowed flowers, my chest swelling as I watched guests file in, laughing, hugging, sipping drinks. I imagined the photos already, the album my grandchildren might one day flip through. I would be there, smiling with the quiet joy of a mother who had endured everything for this day. But the first cracks appeared even before the ceremony began. My daughter-in-law's mother swept in with a new gown that glimmered under the lights, her hair sculpted, her jewels catching every camera. Guests circled her with compliments, and my own presence seemed to shrink, my green dress paling beside her sparkle. She looked at me only once, her eyes sliding over me like dust on the floor. And when the photographer approached for the family portraits, she moved forward with the confidence of ownership, planting herself by my son's side as if the place had always belonged to her. Still, I held my ground. I stepped closer, smiling even though my hands trembled, telling myself this was my right, my moment. The photographer gestured politely, arranging us, asking me to move slightly to the left. I obeyed. Then came the whisper, quick as a blade, "Stand aside, as if you don't exist." My blood froze. For a moment I thought I had misheard, that the music and chatter had twisted her words. But when I glanced at her face, her smile gleamed at the crowd while her eyes bored into me with quiet triumph. The photographer lifted the camera again, and before I could react, the shutter clicked. The laughter around us, maybe at a joke, maybe at nothing at all, swelled until it felt like it was laughing at me, at my stillness, at my silence. I forced a smile, though inside I was collapsing. My son did not see, or pretended not to. He laughed with his new wife, straightened his tie, posed again, while I hovered at the edge of the frame, blurred, unnecessary. My mind spun back to every sacrifice etched into my skin. The nights I scrubbed hospital floors until my fingers cracked so he could buy school books. The mornings I woke at 4 to pack lunches, whispering blessings into sandwiches he never noticed. The afternoons I sold cakes in the square to cover his bus fare for university. All of it, decades of invisible labor, reduced to this single instruction: you ruin every memory. The rest of the evening unfolded in a haze. I watched from the corner as plates of food were served, as speeches were made, as couples danced. Guests clinked glasses, toasts were offered, and every camera flash felt like a knife, each one capturing a celebration that had erased me. Once during the meal, I tried to rise and join a table where cousins sat, but the seats were full, and no one shifted to make room. I carried my plate back to my corner and ate in silence, chewing food that turned to sand in my mouth. From a distance, I must have looked like any other guest, but inside, I knew I had been relegated to the shadows, a ghost at the edge of my own son's joy. As the music swelled and laughter filled the hall, I slipped out quietly to the garden, the cool night air sharp against my cheeks. I sat on a stone bench and stared at the lit windows, hearing muffled shouts of joy spill into the dark. My hands trembled in my lap, clutching the folded napkin I had carried out by mistake. I thought of my husband, gone these many years, and wondered what he would say if he saw this. Would he rage? Would he weep? Or would he simply place a hand on my shoulder and remind me that dignity can survive even in humiliation? I closed my eyes and whispered to the night, "I am here. I exist." The words felt brittle, but they were mine. And in that moment, I realized the cruelty of the whisper inside the hall was not just about photographs. It was about erasing me from the story altogether. When the music faded hours later and guests spilled out into the night, I walked home alone. My shoes ached, my hairpins loosened, my dress clung damp with sweat. I carried no photos, no memories to frame. Only the echo of that whisper lodged in my chest. At my room, I lit a small candle and laid my dress across the chair. I thought of the album that would one day sit on their coffee table, glossy pages filled with smiles, toasts, laughter, and I imagined myself not there, as if I had never stood in that hall at all. My daughter-in-law would see to that. She had spoken her command into my ear, and the world had obeyed. But lying in bed, staring at the cracked ceiling, I made a promise to myself. If they wanted me invisible, I would refuse to disappear. If they pushed me to the edges, I would plant myself firmly there and remind them that shadows are still part of the light. The night after the wedding, I lay awake, staring at the ceiling of my small rented room, the whisper still rattling in my ears. "You ruin every memory. Stand aside as if you don't exist." Over and over the words replayed, more painful than the ache in my feet, sharper than the pins that had dug into my scalp from the braid I had worn too tightly. I thought about how I had ironed that green dress for hours, how I had imagined standing beside my son for the photographs, immortalized in his new beginning. Instead, I had been pushed to the shadows like a stranger. And I could not help but ask myself, how did it come to this? How did decades of sacrifice end in a whisper that denied my very existence? I began to sift through my memories, one by one, like receipts in a box, each marked with the price I had paid. The year was 1999 when my husband first fell ill. He had always been the strong one, working in construction, his back bent under weight I could barely imagine. But the cough came suddenly, deep and harsh, and within months he was gone, leaving me with our son, then only 11, staring at me with eyes too wide, too scared. That was when I promised myself, and him, that I would carry us both. I took the night shifts at the hospital, scrubbing floors that reeked of bleach and sickness, my knees raw, my lungs stinging from chemicals. I brought home barely enough to cover rent and beans, but it was something. My hands aged twice as fast, but I told myself it was worth it. For him. Always for him. By 2005, he was in high school, taller now, his voice deepening. He wanted books, supplies, things his classmates had and he did not. I sold cakes in the plaza on weekends, standing in the sun until my skin burned, just to give him money for outings so he wouldn't feel ashamed. I remember once he asked for a pair of shoes, black leather, cost 120 rays. It was half my pay that week, but I bought them. The look on his face when he wore them to school erased my exhaustion, at least for a moment. Every small victory of his became my fuel, every smile my reward. In 2009, he started talking about university. My heart clenched with both pride and fear. How could I pay for it? Tuition, bus fares, food. But I told him not to worry. I took double shifts, cleaning offices by day and hospital wards by night. I remember falling asleep standing once, my forehead against a wall, mop still in my hand. My supervisor shouted, but I kept working. I saved every coin, stretching rice and beans until they seemed endless. And when the acceptance letter came, I cried harder than I had since the day his father died. I whispered to the photo of my husband, "He will have the life we dreamed." The years that followed blurred into a rhythm of sacrifice. I pawned my wedding ring to cover a semester's fees. I cut my hair at home with dull scissors so I could buy him textbooks. I wore the same winter coat for 10 years, patching the elbows, while I bought him jackets so he would look presentable. I even borrowed money from neighbors once, ashamed, just to cover his exam fees. Every sacrifice carried a promise in my heart. One day he would stand tall, successful, and he would look at me with gratitude. I imagined the words I longed to hear. "Mama, I couldn't have done this without you." But gratitude became scarce as he grew. By 2015, when he graduated, he hugged me stiffly, embarrassed perhaps, as if I were a reminder of the poverty he wanted to leave behind. I still clapped until my hands burned, shouting his name into the air. I told myself it didn't matter if he didn't see me in that moment. A mother doesn't need applause. A mother only needs to know her child is safe, moving forward. Then came the job offers, the suits, the new friends, the girlfriend who would become my daughter-in-law. At first, I welcomed her with open arms. I cooked meals she said she loved, lent her my jewelry for parties, smiled when she called me dear. But slowly, I noticed the shifts. She frowned when I told old stories at the table, rolling her eyes as if my words were clutter. She sighed when I asked questions about their plans. And sometimes, when she thought I wasn't looking, she looked at me the way one looks at something old and broken, a piece of furniture that no longer fits the house. I swallowed it all. I told myself she was young, adjusting, that my son would never let her push me aside. But cracks widened with every holiday where I was seated further from the center, every photograph where I was nudged to the edge, every conversation where my words fell unnoticed. And then the wedding came. I saved money for months to buy them a gift, a set of dishes engraved with their initials, something that would last a lifetime. I pictured them serving meals, remembering me each time. But on the night, the box sat unopened on the gift table, ignored in the flood of fancier packages. And then came the whisper, the final cut, the confirmation of what I had feared all along, that in their new life, there was no place for me. As I lay in bed now, replaying it all, the sacrifices piled high in my memory. My son had stepped into his future, yes, but he had done so on the back of my broken body, my sleepless nights, my endless giving, and instead of honor, I was given erasure. I thought of the photographs that would soon be printed, albums filled with joy. I imagined flipping through them and seeing myself blurred, hidden, absent. The irony was sharp. I had worked my whole life to make sure he would be remembered, and in doing so, I had ensured I would be forgotten. But even in the ache, something stirred. Perhaps it was anger, perhaps it was survival. A thought formed in me, stubborn and fragile. I had given them everything, but I still had myself. They could erase me from photos, from celebrations, from polite conversations. But they could not erase the truth that lived in me. The ledger of sacrifice etched into my very skin. And as the night deepened, I whispered into the dark, "I am not invisible." The words shook, but they carried the weight of all the years I had survived. The days after the wedding unfolded like a fog I couldn't shake. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the flash of the camera, the curve of her smile, the sharp whisper telling me to stand aside, to vanish. It wasn't just about the photos anymore. It was about something deeper, a current that had been pulling me away from my own son for years, though I had been too blinded by love to notice. Now, the veil was gone, and I could see the shape of it clearly, the manipulation, the small humiliations, the careful erasure that had built toward that moment in the hall. It began innocently, as these things always do. At first, my daughter-in-law was polite. her voice sweet when she called me Mama. She asked for recipes, praised my cooking, leaned close when my son wasn't listening. I wanted to believe her warmth was real, that she loved him and would learn to love me too. But soon, small comments crept in, subtle enough to dismiss, but sharp enough to sting. Your dress is nice, Mama, but maybe too simple for the party. Perhaps it's better if I arrange the flowers, to match the theme. You should rest more, Mama. You look tired when you're around guests. Always wrapped in kindness, always disguised as concern. But slowly, these comments turned into instructions, and instructions turned into rules. By 2018, when they had been dating for 2 years, she was already shaping the rhythm of our family gatherings. My son, once eager to sit and eat my feijoa with garlic and lemon, now pushed the bowl aside, saying she didn't like beans at night. He began to laugh at her jokes about old traditions, jokes that cut into the meals I had built with my hands. One Christmas, she moved me to the far end of the table, telling everyone it was better for the children to sit near the center. I laughed it off, but inside, my chest burned. My son didn't notice, or chose not to. He only reached for her hand and poured her wine. Then came the requests that stripped away more than dignity. When they moved into their apartment, she asked me to help clean before they settled in. I scrubbed windows, polished floors, carried boxes until my back screamed. When the job was done, she smiled sweetly and said, "It's good to have someone who knows how to clean properly." My son kissed her cheek as if she had made a clever remark, and I swallowed my anger. Later, when they needed money for furniture, my son asked if I could lend them 3,000 reais. I didn't have it, but I took a small loan from a neighbor and worked double shifts for months to pay it back. They never mentioned the money again, never repaid a cent. When I reminded my son once, softly, he frowned and said, "Mama, don't be petty." Petty. After decades of bleeding for his future, the word lodged in me like a stone I couldn't cough out. The manipulation deepened when the wedding preparations began. At first, I was included, asked about colors, about food, but slowly, I noticed how decisions were made without me, how I was told of plans only after they were finalized. "We thought this would be easier," my son said when I questioned the venue. "She has a vision." I smiled and nodded, but my throat ached. My vision had always been his well-being, his success, his happiness. Now my vision no longer mattered. Then came the humiliation of the dress. I had chosen the green one carefully, pressed it with love, believing it was dignified. But when she saw it a week before the wedding, she pursed her lips. "It's fine," she said, "but maybe stand at the back during photos. We don't want the colors to clash." I told myself it was vanity, nothing more. I laughed to cover my shame. But the words returned to me later, sharp as glass. She didn't want me beside them. She wanted me hidden. And still, I pressed the dress and wore it proudly, because I refused to let her decide how much space I deserved to take. And then the wedding day itself, the whisper, the laughter, the deliberate cutting of me from the frame. It wasn't an accident. It was the culmination of years of small wounds, each one slicing deeper, each one designed to tell me I did not belong. My son stood there, complicit in his silence, his arm wrapped around the woman who erased me. And in that silence, I understood something I had been too afraid to face. It wasn't only her. It was him, too. He had allowed it, chosen it, perhaps even wanted it. He had traded me for peace in his new world, and I was the cost. The thought hollowed me. I remembered him as a boy, asleep on my chest, his breath warm against my skin. I remembered holding his hand on his first day of school, his small fingers gripping mine with trust. I remembered the nights he coughed with fever and I stayed awake, cooling his forehead with wet cloths, whispering prayers. All of it had led to this man who now stood by his wife's side, watching as she erased me with a smile. The boy who once looked at me as if I were the world now looked through me as if I were air. That night, back in my room, I realized the cruelty was not just in the whisper, but in the pattern. The manipulation had been slow, steady, deliberate. I had been trained to accept less, to shrink, to step aside. By the time she spoke those words at the wedding, I had already been living them for years. The photo only sealed what had long been true. In their eyes, I was already invisible. But as I stared at the cracked wall, something hardened inside me. If they wanted me to be invisible, I would refuse. If they pushed me aside, I would plant myself firmly there and let them trip over me every time they tried to pretend I wasn't real. I didn't know yet what form that defiance would take, but I knew one thing with certainty. I had given them everything, and I still remained. They could laugh, they could whisper, they could cut me from photographs, but they could not erase the fact that I had built the life they now stood on. And I would not let them forget it. The weeks after the wedding moved like a cruel tide, dragging me further into a silence I hadn't chosen. I tried, at first, to convince myself that the whisper in my ear, the laugh that followed, the way I was pushed to the edge of every photo was just nerves, just the chaos of a wedding day. I told myself she hadn't meant it, that my son would call, would explain, would tell me that what I heard wasn't what she meant. But the call never came. The photos were shared on social media before I ever saw them, glossy albums of joy, tables heavy with food, smiles frozen forever. And when I scrolled through them on an old phone that lagged at every swipe, I felt the ground tilt beneath me. I was there in only one picture, blurred, half hidden behind a cousin, as if I had wandered accidentally into someone else's celebration. In every other frame, I was gone. My chest tightened as I stared at the images. The album told the story of a wedding where I did not exist. Her mother was everywhere, laughing beside my son, dancing with him, standing close in the family portraits that should have been mine. My heart thudded painfully as I realized this was no accident. This was the final act of something long planned, to erase me not just from the day, but from the record of it. If photographs are memory, then they had stolen mine, cut me away until the story looked whole without me. I dropped the phone on the bed, my hands shaking, and whispered, "You cannot cut me out of the life I built." But my own voice sounded small, as if the walls themselves didn't believe me. The manipulation didn't stop at photographs. Days later, when I finally gathered courage to call my son, his tone was stiff, guarded. He said they were busy, that things were hectic after the wedding. I asked if I could visit, bring food, maybe see how they were settling into the apartment. There was a pause, the kind that stretches long enough to bruise. Then he said, "Mama, it's better if you give us some space. She needs time to adjust. Please, don't make this harder." The words struck like a blade turned in the wound. Harder. I had spent decades making everything easier for him, working double shifts so he wouldn't worry, swallowing humiliation so he could stand tall, bending my back until it nearly broke to keep the roof above us. And now he asked me not to make his life harder, as if my very presence were a weight pressing down. I tried again a week later. This time it was she who answered the phone. Her voice was syrup, but beneath it lay steel. "It's not a good time," she said. "We're trying to build our own family, you understand? We need privacy. We'll call you when we're ready." My lips trembled as I whispered, "I am his family." But the line had already gone dead. I sat with the phone in my lap, my reflection trembling on the darkened screen. I wanted to scream, to break it, to march to their door and demand to be seen. But instead, I pressed it to my chest and wept quietly, because pride is the last shield of the discarded. Then came the request that broke something inside me, the impossible one, the one I will never forget. They invited me for coffee on a Sunday, and for a moment my heart soared, thinking maybe there was a bridge left to cross. I dressed carefully, chose a blouse I had saved for years, and carried a cake I had baked with trembling hands. But when I arrived, she was already waiting at the door. Her smile was thin, brittle. My son hovered behind her, silent. We sat, the three of us, around a table too quiet for comfort. And then she leaned forward, her hands folded neatly, and spoke. "Listen," she said softly. "We think it would be better if you stopped introducing yourself as his mother at events. People get confused. They know my mother. They see her. They think of her as family. You're important, of course, but it's simpler if you let us handle how we present ourselves. For the photos, for the future. Her words came like slow poison, polite, deliberate, impossible to misunderstand. I stared at her, at the curve of her mouth, at the way my son shifted uncomfortably but said nothing. My blood turned to ice. Stop calling myself his mother. The title I had carved with blood, with hunger, with years of sacrifice, was now too inconvenient for her story. I placed the cake gently on the table, though my hands wanted to fling it across the room. My voice came out low, shaking but steady. I am his mother. Nothing you say will change that. For a moment, silence. Then she smiled again, tilting her head. Of course. We just mean, for appearances. My son looked away, his eyes fixed on the floor. That hurt more than her words. His silence was the nail sealing the coffin. I left the apartment with my chest hollow, the streets tilting under my feet. I walked for hours, the cake still in its tin under my arm, untouched. The city lights blurred into streaks, and I realized I was not just fighting her. I was fighting him too, the boy I had raised, the man who now let me be erased to keep his peace. It wasn't just humiliation anymore. It was exile, carried out with a smile and sealed with silence. That night, back in my room, I couldn't eat. I sat on the bed, staring at the tin until the cake grew stale. I thought of all the birthdays I had baked for him, the candles lit with trembling hope, the wishes whispered over slices of sponge and cream. And now this final cake, uncut, uneaten, the symbol of a mother no one wanted in the picture. My body shook with sobs until the candle by my bed burned low. And in the dark, I whispered the truth I had avoided. They did not want me in their lives at all. Not in their photos, not in their stories, not even in the name of mother. But beneath the despair, something else stirred. Not forgiveness, not yet, but a raw ember of resistance. If they thought I would accept erasure, they had forgotten who I was. I had survived hunger, widowhood, years of exhaustion. I had built a man out of a boy with my bare hands. And though they wanted me silent, invisible, erased, I swore to myself in that moment, I would not vanish. The morning after I left their apartment with the untouched cake still in my hands, I sat in my room staring at it until the sun came up. The sugar had hardened on the edges, the frosting dulled, but it wasn't the cake that felt wasted. It was me. Every slice I had baked in the past, every celebration I had carried on my shoulders, every candle I had lit in the dark so my son could make a wish, all of it now mocked me. They had asked me not to call myself his mother, and the words clung to me like smoke, choking every breath. I knew then that this wasn't simply a matter of pride or jealousy. It was deliberate. They were constructing a life where I didn't exist. One where her mother stood in the center of every photo and I lingered in the shadows until I disappeared. I forced myself to move, to walk, to keep the silence from burying me alive. I went to the market for bread and beans, and as I crossed the aisles, I overheard two women chatting near the tomatoes. One of them held a phone, scrolling through wedding photos. She looked radiant, one said. Her mother, too. What a beautiful family. My chest tightened. My ears roared, but I stayed quiet, pretending to compare prices. The photos were already doing their work. They had rewritten history. To the world, it was as if I had never been there. I returned to my room shaking, clutching the loaf of bread like a lifeline, and for the first time in my life I wondered if madness might creep in and take me. The next week, a neighbor from my old street called me. Her voice was hesitant, soft, as if she carried news too sharp to hand over directly. I thought you should know, she said. They told people at the wedding that you preferred not to be in the photos, that you wanted to stay in the background, that you don't like attention. My breath caught. I gripped the phone tighter, pressing it against my ear until it hurt. They told people I chose to erase myself. The humiliation of the whisper had now become a lie told in my name, reshaping me into someone complicit in my own disappearance. My neighbor went on, and some are saying, well, they say you've been distant for years, that you don't like being involved. I thanked her, my voice cold, and ended the call. I sat in silence, the phone heavy in my hand, rage boiling under my skin. They hadn't just erased me, they had rewritten me. That night, I pulled out the shoebox where I had saved every receipt, every proof of sacrifice. Tuition payments, rent stubs, grocery lists, electricity bills, doctor's visits, all signed and stamped with the years of my life. I spread them on the floor like holy scripture, each one a line of evidence that I had not been absent, not distant, not silent. I whispered to them like prayers. I was there. I was always there. My hands shook as I touched the ink, as though holding onto those papers could keep me from floating away into the void they had created. Days passed, but the lie grew louder. At church, a woman approached me, smiling too kindly. "It must have been your choice," she said. "You're so humble, staying out of the spotlight, letting her mother shine." I bit my lip until I tasted blood, nodding politely while my insides screamed. Humble. That was the word they used to cover my erasure, as if humility meant invisibility, as if silence was virtue, when in truth it was exile. I went home and wept, my body shaking, but in the middle of the sobs, something sharp crystallized. If they wanted to spread lies, I would uncover the truth. I thought of the documents I had signed months before the wedding, the ones my son had placed before me with hurried explanations. "Just insurance papers, Mama. Nothing complicated." I hadn't read them carefully, blinded by trust. But now suspicion coiled in me like a snake. What if those papers had been more? What if, just as they had rewritten my place in the photographs, they had also rewritten my place in his life with ink and signatures? The next morning, I went to the city office, clutching my identification with hands slick from sweat. I waited in line for hours, watching clerks stamp papers, shuffle files, erase and restore lives with the push of a button. When it was finally my turn, I asked about my son's address, about the documents tied to his name. The clerk clicked her keyboard, her face blank, until she paused, frowning. "There was a recent transfer," she said. "Ownership listed under him and his wife, with her mother as witness." My stomach dropped. "And before?" I asked. She looked again. "Your name was there as co-signer, but it was transferred last year." She slid a copy across the counter, and there it was, my signature at the bottom, familiar and undeniable. I remembered the day he had asked me to sign, his hand resting lightly on my shoulder, his voice calm. I had trusted him, and now that trust was a blade turned against me. I walked out of the office numb, clutching the papers, the city spinning around me. Not only had they erased me from photos, they had erased me from the very ground beneath their lives. Back in my room, I laid the papers beside the shoebox of receipts. The contrast seared my eyes. On one side, decades of proof that I had built everything. On the other, a single page that stripped me of recognition, crafted with my own hand. Betrayal didn't just wear my daughter-in-law's smile. It wore my son's voice, the one that had once called me Mama with love. I stared at the ceiling long into the night, the lie echoing louder than any truth I could hold. And in that silence, a realization settled like stone in my chest. They had not only tried to make me invisible, they had tried to make me complicit in my own erasure. And that was a cruelty I could not forgive. The morning after I unfolded those papers on my bed, I woke with the taste of iron in my mouth, as if I had swallowed rust. I didn't bother with coffee. I sat on the edge of the mattress, my hands gripping the folder so tightly the corners bent. I had signed away my place without even knowing, blinded by the voice I trusted most, my own son. The shame burned deeper than any humiliation his wife could ever deliver. It was one thing to be pushed aside by her, but another to be betrayed by the boy I had carried in my arms, the boy I had bled for, the boy who now stood silently while I was erased. For hours I couldn't move, the documents lying across my lap like a coffin. But eventually, I forced myself to stand, to breathe, to do something other than drown in the quiet. I decided to go back to the legal aid office. If there was a clause that bound me to that family in ink, maybe there was another that could defend me. I walked with heavy steps, each one echoing in my bones, until I stood once again in the dim hallway, ticket in hand. When my turn came, I slid the papers across the desk, my voice shaking as I asked what they truly meant. The lawyer, the same man with the navy tie and weary eyes, read slowly, his brow furrowed. Then he looked up at me. "You did sign the transfer," he said carefully. "But here, look closer." His pen tapped a paragraph near the bottom. "There's a reservation of habitation. It states clearly that you retain the right to reside in the property, specifically the smaller bedroom, for the duration of your life. They cannot remove you legally. They cannot sell without acknowledging that right." My breath hitched. I leaned forward, rereading the words, letting each syllable burn into my mind. So it was true. I had been tricked into signing, but I had not been erased entirely. My son and his wife had counted on my ignorance, had expected me never to notice the line, never to question. The lawyer continued, "You must understand, paper is power. If they try to force you out, you have grounds. You are not powerless." The words lodged in me like sparks, faint, but alive. For days I had felt like a shadow, like smoke drifting from a fire already extinguished. Now, for the first time, I felt a coal glowing inside. They wanted me invisible, but the law itself said I still had a place. The back bedroom, small and humble, but mine by right. They could shut doors, they could spread lies, they could cut me from photos, but they could not erase the ink. I left the office with the stamped copies clutched to my chest. Outside, the city was loud, buses groaning, horns blaring, vendors shouting about pineapples and beans. I sat on a bench in the sun and read the clause again and again until the words blurred. People rushed past me without looking, but I felt steadier than I had in weeks. It wasn't victory, but it was a weapon. And after so many years of swallowing silence, even the smallest weapon felt like salvation. Still, fear coiled in me. Paper might promise protection, but paper couldn't stop cruelty. I remembered her whisper in the wedding hall, her smile slicing me open while everyone laughed. I knew she would not surrender easily. And my son, would he stand with her? Or would he remember who carried him through sickness and hunger? I wasn't sure anymore. That uncertainty gnawed at me more than any legal battle. I decided not to confront them immediately. I needed to be prepared, not just with documents, but with witnesses, with strength. So I went to a neighbor from the old street, Dona Teresa, a woman with a sharp tongue and eyes that missed nothing. When I told her everything, laying out the papers on her kitchen table, she pressed her lips together and shook her head. "They've been talking," she said, "saying you chose to step back, that you wanted peace away from them. Lies. All lies." I knew something wasn't right. She squeezed my hand. "If you go back, I will come with you. You will not face them alone." The promise loosened the knot in my chest. For so long, I had carried every burden by myself, convinced it was my role as mother, as widow, as survivor. To have someone offer to stand beside me felt like water on parched lips. I thanked her with tears burning my eyes, and for the first time in weeks, my sobs weren't from despair, but from the faintest glimmer of hope. That night, in the boarding house, I spread the documents across my bed again. The baby in the next room laughed, the sound bubbling through the thin walls, and I smiled despite myself. I thought of all the birthdays, all the nights awake with fevers, all the sacrifices that had built my son's life. They wanted to erase me, but the truth was written into every corner of his existence. Even if they painted over me in photographs, even if they silenced me in gatherings, the ink of my sacrifices would not wash away. I whispered into the dark, not as a prayer this time, but as a vow. "You cannot erase me. I will not disappear." The words felt stronger than before, like bricks laid into a foundation I could stand on. Tomorrow I would plan. Tomorrow I would act. But tonight, I let myself feel the weight of something I had nearly lost. Dignity. Fragile but alive, pulsing like a heartbeat inside me. The morning I decided to face them, the city looked different. The sky was washed pale. The air smelled faintly of rain, and every sound seemed sharper. The bark of a stray dog, the rattle of a bus engine, the call of a vendor. I dressed carefully, folding the documents into a plastic sleeve so no drop of water could smudge the ink. I slipped them into my bag as though they were a weapon. My heart pounded not with fear, but with the kind of trembling a soldier must feel before battle. For the first time since the wedding, I walked toward their apartment not as a mother begging to be seen, but as a woman carrying proof that she could not be erased. When I turned onto their street, my knees almost buckled. The building loomed ahead, bright curtains fluttering from their balcony. I paused across the road, gathering breath, my pulse hammering in my throat. I whispered the words of the clause again, like armor. Reservation of habitation. Lifetime right. Back bedroom. Then I stepped forward. I rang the bell. At first, silence. Then footsteps. The door opened just enough to reveal her face. My daughter-in-law's eyes widened for a second, then narrowed into that familiar smile of condescension. "Oh, you." Her voice was sweet, too sweet, like syrup hiding poison. "What brings you here?" Before I could answer, my son appeared behind her. His tie was loosened, his shirt wrinkled from work. For a brief moment, I saw the boy I had raised, the child who once clung to my skirt, eyes filled with trust. But that vision shattered as quickly as it came. His expression was guarded, heavy with irritation. "Mama, we told you." I cut him off, my voice steady in a way that surprised me. "No, you don't get to tell me anymore." I pulled the documents from my bag and held them up. "Do you see this? Do you see what it says? You may have thought I wouldn't read. You may have thought I would stay silent. But the ink doesn't lie. I have the right to be here. In that house. In that room. For the rest of my life." The words hung in the air like thunder. My daughter-in-law's smile faltered for the first time. Her eyes darted to the papers, then back to me. "That clause means nothing," she snapped, her sugar tone gone. "No one will enforce it. Do you really want to embarrass yourself? To embarrass him?" She gestured toward my son as if he were a shield. I stepped closer, my hand trembling but firm. "Embarrass? I cleaned hospital floors for 20 years so he could go to university. I went hungry so he could eat. I carried debts, worked myself to the bone, sold the last pieces of jewelry I had so he could stand where he is today. You think embarrassment can touch me after all that? You think I care if neighbors whisper? Let them. What I won't allow is for you to erase me from the home I built." My son's jaw tightened. He looked at me, then at her, then back at the papers in my hand. His silence was a wound deeper than any insult. He didn't defend me, didn't defend her. He just stood there, suspended between two worlds, choosing absence. I felt tears sting my eyes, but I refused to let them fall. "Say it," I demanded softly. "Look at me and say I'm not your mother. Say I never gave everything for you." He opened his mouth, but no words came. His silence screamed louder than any denial. My daughter-in-law stepped forward, blocking his view of me, her voice low and sharp. "You should leave before this gets ugly. We don't need drama. You don't belong here anymore." I lifted the papers higher. "That's where you're wrong. I do belong, and I will not leave. If I have to stand here every day until the neighbors know the truth, I will. If I have to walk into court with these in my hand, I will. You cannot bury me with lies. You cannot cut me out of his life with whispers and smiles." Her face twisted, anger replacing the practiced charm. She reached for the door, slamming it shut, but I pressed my palm against the frame. For a heartbeat, we stood locked there, her glare against my steady eyes. Then I pulled my hand away and let the door close, the sound echoing like a gunshot. I stood on the steps, my breath ragged, my hands shaking. I had not won entry. I had not reclaimed my room, but I had spoken. For the first time in years, I had not swallowed the humiliation. I had forced them to see me, to hear me, to confront the truth they wanted hidden. As I turned and walked away, neighbors peered through curtains, whispers already buzzing. Let them talk, I thought. Let them know. My erasure would no longer be silent. When I reached the corner, I stopped and leaned against the wall, the documents pressed to my chest. Tears slid down my cheeks, hot and relentless. But this time they weren't just tears of grief. They were tears of defiance. They had tried to make me invisible, but I had shown them I still stood, still spoke, still lived. That night, back in the boarding house, I replayed every word, every look. The pain was sharp, but beneath it a strange strength pulsed. For the first time in decades, I wasn't just surviving for others. I was fighting for myself. And as I closed my eyes, whispering again, "I will not disappear," I believed it more than ever. The morning after I confronted them, the city felt louder than usual. I woke before the sun had risen, my hands still trembling as though the words I had spoken at their door were trapped inside my bones. I washed my face in cold water, staring at my reflection in the cracked mirror of the boarding house. For the first time in years, I saw something alive in my eyes. Not joy, not peace, but fire. A flame that had been nearly extinguished at the wedding when she whispered that I should disappear. That flame had survived. I left the room early, clutching the folder of documents like a talisman. On the street, neighbors glanced at me differently. Whispers rippled through the air. Word of my visit had already spread. I saw Donna Yvonne, the woman who had always sold fruit from a cart at the corner. She called me over, her face solemn. "I heard what happened," she said softly. "Good for you standing up. They think we don't notice, but we do. You were always the one who carried that boy. Always the one who worked." Her words struck deep because they were recognition, something I had been denied for too long. I thanked her, fighting the sting in my throat. Recognition is a kind of water to someone starved of it. But not all looks were kind. As I walked past the bakery, two younger women whispered, their eyes sliding over me with pity. "It's sad," one murmured. "She should just let go. They don't want her." Their words floated to me like ash. I carried them anyway, but this time I refused to let them burn through me. I had carried worse. By noon, I returned to the legal aid office, determined to understand what more could be done. The lawyer greeted me with the same weary eyes, but listened carefully as I recounted the confrontation. "They will try to intimidate you," he said. "They may even try to sell despite the clause. You must be ready. The law is on your side. But you need evidence, witnesses, a voice louder than theirs." His advice settled heavy in my chest. I had always been silent, always swallowed my words. Now I was being asked to use them like armor. I nodded. "Then I will." That evening, I walked back to the old neighborhood, not to their door, but to the people who had known me for years. I spoke with Teresa, with Yvonne, with the old man who fixed shoes on the corner. Each remembered something. Me rushing to work at dawn, me carrying groceries, me helping with their children. "We all saw you," Teresa said, squeezing my hand. "You were never invisible to us." Their words were small lanterns in the dark, proof that my erasure was only inside their walls, not in the world beyond. The days that followed were filled with both whispers and strength. Some pitied me, some mocked me quietly, but others rallied, offering words, small gestures, even promises to stand beside me if things grew worse. One afternoon, as I sat outside the church, a woman I barely knew sat beside me. "I lost my son too," she said, her voice low. "Not to death, but to a wife who didn't want me near. I fought for years until I was too tired. Don't let them do the same to you. Speak louder than I did." Her confession felt like a warning and a blessing all at once. Yet the weight of it all was still crushing. At night, I lay awake replaying every moment. The whisper at the wedding, the laughter, the photographs that erased me, the request to stop calling myself his mother. Each memory was a wound, but together they formed a map, a path I could trace from sacrifice to betrayal. The shoebox of receipts still sat under my bed, silent proof of a life spent giving. Sometimes I spread them across the floor and lay among them, as if the papers themselves could embrace me when my son would not. But one evening, as I held one of those receipts, an old electricity bill from 2003 stamped paid, a thought struck me. These papers were not just memories. They were testimony, evidence of a woman who had carried a family alone, who had kept the lights on, the water running, the boy fed and clothed. Evidence that no one could deny, no matter how many photographs were cropped. And for the first time, I realized I had a weapon beyond the legal clause. I had the story of my life, written not in ink, but in sweat and sacrifice. So I made a decision. I would not wait in the shadows for them to decide my fate. I would prepare, gather every piece of proof, every witness, every word, and when the time came, I would not stand at their door begging. I would walk into any room, legal or otherwise, and lay out the truth so loudly it could not be ignored. They had tried to erase me, but the truth was ink that never faded. That night, as I blew out the candle by my bed, I whispered once more, but this time not to myself. You told me to act as if I didn't exist, but I do, and soon, everyone will see it. The following week unfolded like a storm gathering slowly in the distance. I could feel it building, the air thick with tension, the whispers in the neighborhood turning sharper, more insistent. Some people looked at me with pity, others with curiosity, but I had stopped caring about the weight of their gazes. I carried the documents with me everywhere, tucked in my bag like armor. At night, I spread them across the thin mattress of the boarding house, arranging them alongside the shoebox of receipts as if laying out a battlefield. And every morning, I woke with the same thought pulsing through my chest. I will not be erased. It was Donna Teresa who first suggested that I bring others into the fight. We sat in her kitchen one afternoon, the smell of fried onions heavy in the air. She stirred the pot while I showed her the stamped papers once again. She leaned closer, her eyes sharp. You mustn't fight them alone. They've built their story, but stories only stand if no one contradicts them. You have witnesses, people who saw you, who remember. Call on them. Her words dug deep, and for the first time I realized that my silence had always been their strongest weapon. If I spoke, and if others spoke with me, their lie would crumble. So I began quietly, carefully, gathering voices. I spoke with Yvonne, who had seen them carry my bed down the stairs while I was away. She agreed to tell anyone who asked that I had never chosen to leave, that it had been done behind my back. I spoke with the shoemaker who remembered me pawning my ring to pay for my son's tuition. He promised to say so, if ever needed. Even the young girl from the fruit stall whispered that she had often seen me walking home late from double shifts, exhausted but determined. Piece by piece, I was stitching together a tapestry of truth, one they could not unravel with their rehearsed smiles. Meanwhile, I continued to pass their apartment, sometimes catching glimpses through the window. Her mother was always there, seated at the table, laughing freely, her presence solid where mine had been made ghostly. Each sight stabbed me anew, but I forced myself to keep walking, reminding myself that while she sat in comfort, I was preparing. I was building something stronger than proximity. I was building evidence. One evening, as I returned from the clinic after a cleaning shift, I found a group of neighbors gathered outside the bakery. Their voices fell when I approached, but one man stepped forward awkwardly. We heard she told people you preferred not to be in the photos, he said, his eyes darting away. The anger that rose in me was sharp, but I held it steady. I opened my bag, pulled out the documents, and showed him the clause. Does this look like someone who chose to disappear? I asked. His face reddened, and though he said nothing, I saw doubt flicker in his eyes. It was enough. Doubt is the seed that cracks open lies. Word of my defiance began to spread. Some shook their heads, muttering that I should let the young live their lives. Others began to nod in quiet approval, murmuring, "She's right. She built that boy." I didn't need their pity anymore. What I needed was their memory, and memory was on my side. But the hardest confrontation came sooner than I expected. I was walking home one evening when I saw my son across the street, exiting a shop with groceries in hand. For a moment, my body froze. He looked older, tired. The lines of adulthood deepened on his face. For a heartbeat, I saw the child he had been, the boy who once fell asleep in my lap. Then he saw me. His steps faltered, and for a second, I thought he might cross, might speak, might reach for me. But instead, his jaw tightened and he looked away, continuing down the street as if I were a stranger. My throat ached with unspoken words. I wanted to shout after him, to call his name, to force him to look at me. But I stayed silent, my chest heaving. That silence was heavier than all the lies. He hadn't just allowed her to erase me. He had chosen to walk past me as if the decades I spent breaking my back for him meant nothing. I returned to my room shaking, but instead of collapsing, I lit a candle and spread the papers again. I wrote in a notebook every sacrifice, every proof, every witness. It wasn't just for me anymore. It was for the truth. If they thought they could bury me under silence, they would learn that silence can also be broken. And in that moment, I understood something vital. I could never force my son to choose me over her. That battle was already lost. But what I could do, what I would do, was make sure the world knew who I was, what I had given, and what they had tried to take. They might shut their doors, crop me out of photos, lie about my absence, but they would never rewrite the truth that lived in me. As the candle burned low, I whispered again into the dark. You told me to stay aside, as if I didn't exist. But soon, you'll learn. I exist louder than your lies. The night stretched long, and I lay awake listening to the hum of the city outside, the faint cries of the baby in the next room, the creak of footsteps along the boarding house corridor. The world carried on, indifferent to my battles, and yet inside me, something had shifted forever. I was no longer the silent woman pushed to the edge of the photographs, no longer the mother who accepted humiliation as the price of love. I was a woman who had spoken, who had confronted, who had unearthed the truth they thought would remain buried. And though the pain still cut deep, though the wound of my son's silence bled every time I thought of him, I knew now that pain did not erase me. I rose before dawn and spread the shoebox of receipts across the bed once more. Each piece of paper glowed softly in the candlelight, proof of rent paid when no one else could, bills settled with coins counted carefully, tuition covered with shifts that stole sleep from my eyes. These were not just scraps of paper. They were the ledger of my existence, evidence that my life had weight, that my sacrifices were the foundation beneath their comfort. I traced each line with my finger, whispering softly, I was here. I always was. The silence of the room felt less heavy then, as if the walls themselves bore witness. In the days that followed, I continued to walk through the neighborhood, no longer hiding my face. Some people whispered, others turned away, but a few met my eyes with quiet respect. Donna Teresa walked beside me often, her arm linked with mine, her voice firm. They will try again, she reminded me. They will try to sell, to push, to lie. But you have the papers, and you have us. For the first time, I allowed myself to believe that I wasn't alone. Community had replaced the family that had shut me out. Strangers had become the chorus that kept me from disappearing. One Sunday, I returned to the church where I had once sat in the back pew, weeping silently. This time, I walked to the front and lit a candle, my hands steady. I prayed not for reconciliation, not for my son to return to me, but for strength. Strength to stand in court if necessary. Strength to speak when my voice trembled. Strength to live even when the title of mother had been stripped of honor. I prayed, too, for the other women I had met who whispered their own stories of erasure. The mother told she was too much. The grandmother pushed aside for a new matriarch. The widow forgotten when her children found new families. I carried their voices with mine, a chorus of shadows refusing to fade. As I left the church, the sun dipped low, painting the sky in gold and crimson. I walked slowly, breathing deeply, letting the warmth of the light settle on my face. For the first time in months, I did not feel small. My daughter-in-law's whisper echoed again in my memory. You ruin every memory. Stand aside, as if you don't exist. But now, those words no longer pierced. They sounded hollow, powerless against the weight of the truth I carried. I had been the memory. I had been the foundation. I had been the reason her wedding even existed at all. Without me, there would have been no boy to raise into a man, no man for her to marry. That night, I returned to my room, placed the folder and shoebox together, and blew out the candle. In the dark, I lay down and closed my eyes. Not with despair, but with resolve. They might go on pretending I was invisible. They might print albums where my face never appeared. They might tell neighbors and friends that I had chosen to step back. But I knew the truth, and so did those who had watched me survive year after year. The truth was ink and blood, sweat and sacrifice, and no smile or whisper could wash it away. And so I whisper it now, louder than any vow I've ever spoken. I am here. I exist. I am not a shadow. I am not a burden. I am the proof of a life built from nothing, and though they tried to bury me in silence, I will rise louder than their laughter. They cannot erase me. They cannot replace me. I endure. I live. And I will carry my own story, even if I must carve it into stone with my bare hands.